Good morning, everybody. My name's Matt Sump. I'm a Mastercam account executive for Illinois and Iowa here at ShopWare. And helping out today is Alex Zuniga, who's one of our applications engineers, and he'll be helping answering questions. And we're going to get into Mastercam here. So the first thing I want to cover in Mastercam, it's kind of a small update to 2023 here, is if you right-click the icon at the bottom of your Windows screen, it will pop up with a list of your most recent files. And I'm not sure, my audience view here isn't quite showing that window for me. I'm not sure why, maybe because it's taskbar related. But the short story here is if you right click the Mastercam icon in the taskbar, it'll give you a list of all your recent files that you've accessed. So even before you open Mastercam, you can right click and start hopping into whatever file you accessed recently. So the next one I want to cover here is in 2021 or 22, we added direct editing of wireframe entities where you just double click the entity and you can start editing it without having to specifically click on a command or right click or anything like that. So that works the same now for drafting and dimensions in 2023. So if I just double click this drafting entity here, it pops up right away into the drafting edit box and I can modify that drafting entity. So you'll see, as the softwares mature, a lot of these edits are just little quality of life type stuff that we want to make people aware of. It's nothing groundbreaking. The next one is we can now align dimensions in as well as we used to be able to only align notes, but you can align dimensions now as well. So say these dimensions here at the bottom, I want to align. So I can go up to drafting here and say align note. And I've already given this feedback to Mastercam Corporate that they should change the name of this function so that you don't think it only applies to notes. But if I say align note here, it does tell me now with this little white box. And this is another thing I always like to stress as kind of a small tip is make sure you right click the little box or prompt that's asking what Mastercam needs from you and make sure that it's large font and that it's somewhere where you can see it. I've seen people stuff it off in the corner and that little box will say, press enter to continue, and they think their Mastercam's locked up. So I can select what I want to align. So say I want to align this note, and I can say okay or hit enter on my keyboard. Now it says select a spot to align to. So I'm aligning them, but I don't know where yet. Now if I click here, you'll notice that the notes or the dimensions haven't done anything yet. That's because it defaults to none here. So you just want to set, do I want to align it left, center, right to that spot that I picked? And then depending on how the notes are, see if I do right there, this 5-inch dimension doesn't have enough room. So if I center them up, then they're nice and aligned to that point that I selected. And now we can also project dimension entities. So before I could only project notes, I think, and not dimensions. And it only works via to like a certain Z height. Translating to a plane is a future enhancement that we're still working on. Like if I wanted to transform that dimension from the top plane here to the front plane, I'd have to do a different command. But if I do project here, because say I've accidentally made this dimension down at Z0 and the rest of the dimensions are off the top of the part, I can just say project, pick that entity to project, and it'll default to my Z height here at the bottom. So always remember that this Z height control, and if I switch it to 2D, I can force anything I'm creating at a specific Z height. So it's set to copy here. I could switch it to move, and then it'll move that dimension. And then like any sort of transform, red would be the original and pink is the result. So I can always right click, get my attributes manager and say clear colors, and it'll return back to the color the dimension was before. So next thing I want to cover is some wireframe enhancements here. So I have the level on that I need. And one thing I wanted to cover as kind of a small tip, your auto cursor settings here. So you have your little auto cursor settings bar that highlights when you get your mouse near it. If you click the selection settings here, you have some finer tuning control of what you're selecting in Mastercam. Like I always do solids by faces, and I turn off glow highlighting. The glow highlighting is if I hover over the part, everything kind of glows at once. And if I don't have solids by faces turned on, the entire part glows. So it makes it a little hard to do selections, in my opinion. So I always switch it to solids by faces and use glow highlighting. And the other change I always do is quadrant is turned off on the auto cursor by default. So I typically turn quadrant on. So that's just a couple small tips there, not necessarily new items. That was one thing I wanted to do here too, is if I am, say I'm creating a line endpoint, this is a tip that I got from Rob, and I want to make a line tangent to this circle, but I have quadrants turned on and I don't necessarily want to ping it to a quadrant here. If I hold down my Alt key, it temporarily disables the auto cursor, so it won't snap to any of those points if I'm holding down the Alt key. If I let go of the Alt key, it goes back to regular auto cursor and it'll snap. But you know, if you've ever tried to draw a tangent line between two arcs, let's say, you don't necessarily want to select on the auto cursor positions. You just want the line to be tangent to the arc. So holding down Alt here allows me to create that tangent line between those two arcs easily without getting messed up by the auto cursor. And one other auto cursor tip that Rob gave me here is under my right click menu, I can add a function here to force, you know, sometimes say you want to pick on the arc center and you're selecting drill points or something like that. I can click in here and say auto cursor and force it to arc center. But what a lot of people don't know is I can right click here and say customize the ribbon, and then go to all commands. And actually I want to do it in the context menu if I want to add it to my right click. So I say context menu, that's my right click menu. I can say all commands here and then go to all these auto cursor lock commands. So these aren't in the toolbar at the top. So I could add, for instance, auto cursor arc center to my right click. And then if I do that, I already set it up here because I'd already clicked it. But now that I'm forced to arc center, it's going to pick on the arc center of all of these if I was selecting them for, say, a drilling command. So just a couple little auto cursor tips that I don't think everyone's aware of. That the right click arc center lock I didn't know until Rob told me about. The alt key trick I had known, I just hadn't made people aware of it before. So trim to entities now supports splines. So I have a spline here, and before, if I wanted to trim this spline to that line, it would be pretty difficult. I would have to do like an extend command and then go back into the trimming commands. But now I can just go to trim to entities, pick on this spline, let's say, and I can just select that line and it trims it right up to that without having to do all those extra steps of extending and then trimming them together. And then I could always use like the trim divide to get rid of the extra section of this line that I don't need. And one of the questions that popped up when we did the in-person rollout was, can I do that from spline to spline? And the answer is yes. I can trim one spline to another spline and have them perfectly match up using that same trim to entities command. Next one I wanted to cover here is under the create rectangle command. If I just want to create a rectangle here like I would normally do it, it has my wireframe there, but we now have the option for creating additional geometry. So sometimes people will be making like a blank off surface or something like that, and you would draw the wireframe first and then create the surface. Well, now I can turn on this checkbox here and it'll create a surface, a sheet solid, or a mesh, depending on what I wanted to do. But for this next little tip I wanted to show you, I don't necessarily want to create that surface, so I'll just leave that off and create this box here. One thing I think a lot of people don't know about, and I think this is the last kind of bonus tip I got from Rob, is I don't think a lot of people know about the stretch command in here and kind of the easiest way to select and do that. Say I was doing a 3D toolpath and I was using a containment boundary and I needed to move the boundary a little further out. A lot of people would transform this line here, move it over, and then trim up these lines to match up with it. So it's a perfect, chainable loop. But what I can do is I can do stretch, and then the easiest way to do it is window intersecting entities to stretch. So I want to window the 3 sides of this rectangle, say okay, and then now I can extend this containment boundary, like I said in the example there, really as far, or I can reduce it if I need to, depending on what I'm doing with the toolpath. But that stretch command is a nice one that I think a lot of people are so used to using just dynamic or just regular transform or translate and then trimming it up, that it can be a pretty good time saver if you get into a lot of containment boundary type use. Now, the next one I want to show here is another kind of smaller change, but if I go to my levels, I can go to split by solid face here. So split by solid face is a handy tool that we've had in the software for a while, but anyone that's done it where you're splitting it based off of existing wireframe, before I would say split solid face, and then I would have to either force it to wireframe selection, turn off the level of the solid, or rotate my part just right so that I could select on the wireframe. But now if I do split solid face here and say, it says select solid face to split, say I want to split the top of this cylinder here, and now it goes right away into selecting the wireframe or solid edge to be used for splitting. Now, if it's an area where there's both a solid edge already, I probably don't need to split it. So typically people are using wireframe to split if they're not using the flow lines as kind of a free-form way to split the face. But if I'm using wireframe now, it automatically defaults into wireframe mode. And I can just say, okay, I want to split it right there. Say okay, hit apply. And then now if I turn off my wireframe here, that face is split. And then I can do any sort of, model prep that I was planning on doing to it. Maybe I'm making some soft jaws or something like that. And it just makes it easier to modify the geometry using that command. Now, one other small change here is, say I need to translate this line and offset it, but I'm not necessarily using offset. I just want to use regular translate. If I go to transform, translate, and that's the line I want to translate, it now defaults to the delta based on the plane. So I can still always use the slider bar here and, either snap to specific values. I can type in a value, but without ever having to click over in the graphics area, it'll now, it tries to be smart in like how the geometry is drawn on what it defaults to. So this one defaulted to X. So I could say X plus 1 and it moves it over without having to fool with the graphical controls. It'll just default into this new delta section where the software didn't do that before. And then one last translate update on this file is when I'm doing translate to plane. Before, you were probably used to seeing that little extra box that would pop up, and it was kind of the old school window of Mastercam plane selection, where now it just is incorporated into the tab manager plane here. So I can just say, I want to translate from top to front, and it's all within this command window here, as opposed to popping up multiple prompts, and then you'd have to confirm that prompt and go in and out of it. So just another example of a small update that's reducing the number of mouse clicks you have to do for commonly used commands. So the next one is I'm going to open up a separate file here, and I can't necessarily drag and drop it into Mastercam. So I have a step file here. It's actually the same file that we've been working on, or the solid model that you guys saw in the beginning. But if I'm bringing in you can't see the air quotes I'm doing, but like a dumb solid, so a step file in this case, or maybe it's just a generic parasolid file, and I want to start getting an idea of the hole geometry that I'm dealing with in the file. If I go to File Open here, and I go to the folder I'm looking for, so it defaults to all Mastercam files. I want to say all files here. But if I click on this step file, if anyone's unfamiliar, if I'm opening up a file that's not a native Mastercam file, I'll always have a certain amount of options depending on the type of file. So with this being a generic solid format, some of the options I have in here is, I can always bring it in as solids or as trimmed surfaces. But the new option we added in here is what's called create hole operations, which we added that function a while ago, but now this is just doing it at the time of file open. So if I say create hole operations and say, okay, now when I bring in this step file, no, I don't want to save that. Now you can see it created center points where all the closed arc entities are. And then if I go to my solids manager here, you can see it says 1A hole table there. And it basically gives me the size and type for all the different holes that are in that given part. So that's just a quick way to, say you don't have a print of the part and you need to get an idea of what tooling you're going to need for the hole making on that particular file, then it's all right there already for you. So the next one I want to cover, I have to give a bit of a disclaimer. So we've always had requests for years for people being able to open a PDF file. But for those of you that don't know, a PDF is really just a fancy image file that Adobe's kind of cornered the market on making it a interchange file format for everybody. So for 2023 here, we've added support to import PDFs. Now, my main disclaimer here is, if it's a scanned PDF that doesn't look that great and there's a ton of noise, like, extra printing on the sheet that's not necessarily part of the geometry, it's not going to bring everything in. But what we've found from testing is that even a scanned one is going to give me some of the geometry where I can start recreating it, so I can start toolpathing it. If it is a PDF, say my customer is sending me a PDF from SolidWorks and they haven't sent me the actual SolidWorks file, or they refuse to send me the SolidWorks file, I have a couple PDFs in my folder here on my other monitor. And this first one I can bring in, and I can just drag and drop it like I would any other file type in Mastercam. There's not really any options associated to the PDFs, but it will bring the PDF in as it was created in whatever CAD system. And it will also, if it's a multi-page PDF, it'll split the pages onto view sheets. So those are always here at the bottom. If you're not seeing the view sheets, just go up to your view tab here and turn view sheets on. Some people turn them off. I always stress it's a good way to organize your file in Mastercam. There's some additional view sheet enhancements that I'll cover in a little bit. So this is another one that I dragged in from my file folder there. And just to give you an example of, so say I bring this in, this PDF had some dimensions already written on it. So see, I got that 1057 dimension there. I can always right click and say, analyze distance here, which is a default right click menu option. And I can click on, say, this line, and I get my delta change there. So it's 105.67. So this dimension's a little rounded off, but that knows that the PDF that I brought in, the scaling was correct. So if I brought this in and say it was my measured value in Mastercam was exactly double what the dimension is on the print, then that I dragged in, then I would maybe want to adjust the scaling in the transform tab and scale that PDF to the correct size. But just a little additional file support there for 2023 here. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of part setup, transform commands that we've updated, or I would say model prep commands that we've updated for 2023 here. And kind of a bonus to this This function actually has already been in Mastercam. If any of you have already created any 3D lathe tooling, if I wanted to mate the insert to the holder in 3D lathe tooling, it was pretty easy because there was a function that we've now added for all solid models under model prep here called solid position. So basically what it does is it walks me through, we've had the dynamic transform for a while, and if I selected on certain points of, say, the face of this jaw and the face of the part, I could mimic this functionality. But this just makes it a little easier, as well as you're confident knowing that the solid faces are perfectly mated up and not really having to worry about it. So I go into that solid position command. Now it says select a face on the body to be moved. So I want to pick on the jaw face here. Now it's on the face there. I don't necessarily care with this command where it is, or it just says press enter to continue. I'm going to say okay. Now it says select the contact body. It's my stock here. Say okay. Now I can move the selected geometry, but if I move it, it's only moving the face insert of the jaw. Maybe I want to move the entire jaw. So I have the box here for additional geometry. So I can just say add to selection. I don't want to click here because that's reselect, because my contact body of the face is already down here as solid 1. So I add this. Now both of these are linked together because I have my additional geometry as well as the contact body, and I can move it up here. And if you'll notice, there's a bit of a gap here, but it stops. Don't worry about that gap as you're positioning, as you'll see here in a second. But the only thing I wanted to cover is if I drag it way too far and I can actually get past my contact body, it'll kind of let me go off into space. But it gives you quite a bit of leeway here on how you're able to match that up. But once I select where I want to mate it up to, and once I click, that's when I get my exact flush mount of that jaw face there. So it just gives me that little gap as a preview, just so I'm able to select, if I wanted to make sure I selected on that face, for instance. But now if I say okay, it works similar to the transform command in that this jaw is now pink because that's the result of where I moved it. And I can always clear not change level, but clear the colors of what I'm trying to do there. So one other thing I wanted to cover here is just a small change to the push-pull command. So if I turn off my stock level here, I have this bracket part. And before, if I did push-pull on an edge, say like this edge right here, before I was only able to fillet the radius, but now I have an option to also create a chamfer. But the short story there is you can create chamfers as well as fillets on using the push-pull command. So we were talking about view sheets a little bit before, and what we've added to view sheets as well as in the solids manager is we can now organize the view sheets here at the bottom by groups, and I can color the groups. So I always tell people you could really utilize view sheets for different stages of a part. Whether it's a horizontal machine and you want to create the 270, 180, 90 different planes, and if you click to those different views, it'll automatically flip your WCS, so you're ready to program or draw from that plane. But anyone that's worked on a very complex file, you start getting 20 view sheets across the bottom of the screen, and it becomes a little harder to manage. So what I can do is click in and right click here, and I can say, well, it's already in a group, but say this one's not in a group, I can say group, and I can either create a new group off of that view sheet, or I can add it to one of my existing view sheets there. So I added that one to my machining group under the main here, and I can also change the color just as I want to do any sort of organizational output to it. So a small update to the view sheets, but it just adds a little more. Someone like me who likes to be very organized in my files, it's handy just to give me more tools on how I want to organize it. And that same thought process now applies to the solids manager tree. So if you're creating solids in Mastercam, I can group these as well. As you can see, I've kind of grouped a handful of these different operations, or I group the solid operations by group here on this part. So it works the same way for both. Now getting into a little bit of tool pathing. This is some kind of general toolpath enhancements before we get into actual specific toolpath updates. Is on my operations manager here, we were all used to, if I right click on a specific operation, say this 2D high speed, if I right clicked and try to drag it down, it would give me the prompt of, do I want to move it down? Do I want to copy it? You know, say I'm doing a duplicate operation on some separate geometry, things like that. But in the past, if I were to left click, and I've done this myself, just kind of fat fingering it, is if I were to left click and drag this, in the past I could move that wherever. And say I'm working on a big 3D file and I accidentally hold down my left click and I move a finishing toolpath before my original roughing toolpath, and then it marks everything dirty, and I'm like, oh man, it's going to take 15 minutes to regenerate all these 3D toolpaths. Well, now both the left click and the right click have the same behavior of it's going to prompt you before it tries to move any sort of operation around. So just know you don't need to worry about if I accidentally left click and try to move this. It'll still give me the prompt, and if I didn't really want to move it, I can just click cancel there. Another thing with importing operations, and I always like to stress to people, if you're not importing and reusing operations, whether it be from another Mastercam file or from actually building out an operation library, I highly recommend it. You know, if you have a set roughing routine, finishing routines, you can save these out to operation libraries, and then you can reuse it. Saves all the parameters except for the geometry. So I'm just applying what I've done in the past that I know works well to a different shape, essentially. But if I right click here and I say import operations, now we just get a little drop down of files that I've used operations from recently, or actual operation libraries. These are a couple demos I've done personally recently where, you know, I was showing people how I could reuse operations from an existing file, or I could save those operations out to an actual operations library and import them for future use. So if you have a handful of ones you use often and you don't necessarily want to group them all the way you'd organize them by groups here in the actual operation library, I can now have multiple here. We're not sure on quite the limit here yet, but I've had up to 10 in this box now, and it seems to work fine. But I'm sure at some point you would run into a limit on, you know, quick access type files there. So next one I wanted to show here is we added a small update to the advanced toolpath display. So we added the advanced toolpath display a couple versions ago, where instead of just getting the blue geometry for toolpaths and yellow for retract, you now get like colors for reposition moves, lead-in moves, etc. But the one we added for 2023 is we added, if I go to view here, we added what's called dirty toolpath motion. So a toolpath that still needs to be recalculated, I have now the option to show me what that toolpath looked like before it became dirty or needing to be recalculated. So before, I just wouldn't see anything there. It would just, the toolpath would be marked dirty and I wouldn't know what it was. And anyone that's worked on a file with a ton of different, you know, dirty toolpaths that I need to recalculate, say I modified the geometry or brought in a new model, I want to know exactly which one, and if I'm not using comments to know exactly which toolpath is what, it's just an easier way to get some more visual feedback on what my next task is on the given file. Then the last thing I wanted to cover on this particular file is under the parameters here of any mill toolpath now in 2023, you'll notice this tool window looks a little different. Basically, we gave more real estate as people are getting more and more into tool assemblies and highly defined tooling setups, just giving you more room to customize what tools you're specifically using. And also remember that I can always right click in the names here of the columns, and I can turn on and off which ones I do and don't want to see. You know, say you don't use assembly names at your shop, so you can turn that off. I can rearrange these columns as well. If I click and drag, I can move the length in front of the corner radius or move the diameter around. So whichever way you like to see that, once you get that set up the way you want, that same menu will appear the same way in all the Mill Toolpath windows. So I always have people remember to customize it exactly the way you want to see it. So now for about half of you that answered on the survey there that are currently using 2023, one of the things you probably noticed right away is how job setup works on a mill part. And I'm sure I'm getting some eye rolls that I can't see right now, because you might think like, man, this is kind of a pain in the butt compared to the old way. If it wasn't broke, don't fix it sort of deal. And I certainly get that, because when I first tried it in 2023, I'm like, what are they making me do? Little backstory to this: I was at a reseller kind of mini conference back in May in North Carolina, and I was talking to one of the product owners, actually the product owner of Millturn, guy by the name of Lee Richards. And I was asking him, why make this setup more work than what it used to be? And the two answers to this is, A, I really don't need to do anything in this new setup interface if I don't want to. So I don't, the nice part about Mastercam, as it's always been, is I can make the file as simple. I don't need any work holding. I don't necessarily need to define a stock. I can just slap some wireframe on, get a toolpath, and get it out to the machine as fast as possible. But on the flip side of that, if I do want to set up all this stuff, this is kind of walking me through that process of what I need to do to get everything kind of fully set up, so I have collision avoidance, all that sort of stuff. And the interesting thing or tidbit that he told me about this new interface is this is the first step to getting technology in the software that's basically going to keep making it smarter. So this is laying the groundwork. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. Laying the groundwork to make the mill files completely stock and collision avoidance aware. Like anyone now knows, like say I'm doing a 2D dynamic toolpath, I still have to select my clamp or my fixture as like an avoidance. So that's not in the software quite yet, but what this is doing is laying that groundwork so that if I do take the time to set up all my fixturing and all that stuff, that the software, when I go in to do a specific toolpath, it'll know, okay, this is not machining geometry, I want to avoid it. So, the end goal here is to get to where, my retract heights are automatically assigned, I'm automatically avoiding clamps, work holding, anything like that. So that's just my little backstory on why this is different going into 2023. When we're going to see all that avoidance stuff, I'm not quite sure yet. I got kind of a pre-alpha preview of how that works from the Mill product manager a couple months ago, but he isn't quite sure when it's going to be ready for full release. So the way this works and how it relates to the older versions of Mastercam is a lot of these settings are still going to be the same. It's just going to look a little different. So I have my same, what do I want to call my machine group, the post and machine definition I'm using, if I want to have, a program number, sequence number, all that stuff that was on the windows before. Now also what we have is called a master model. So either the part or parts that I want to assign as my machining geometry is I can either add it from a level, I can add it from a selection. So let's just select this solid here, for instance. And I've had some people, they've, say I got a really complex file with a lot of work holding. If I click isolate here, everything disappears. So just remember, I want to select what I want to isolate in the selection here. Then if I turn on isolate, it'll isolate whatever I have selected up here. I'm not sure how many people need to isolate that, but if you're selecting a lot of different small parts, let's say, and you have a bunch of tiny vices, it might make it easier. So now my next page here is the stock setup, and I can add it from selection. I can add it from a file. I would like to see them add an option to add it from a level like we have here on the master model, which they've already noted that for me, and hopefully going to add it here with one of the updates. But I could say add from selection here, And if I say add from selection, it's just going to pick that as my stock. I don't necessarily want that. I want a block that's encompassing, whatever my actual stock is going to be. So what I can do here is I can say add from a bounding box, and I can say select, and I want to use that as my reference to my bounding box. Say okay, and then like any bounding box that we've had in Mastercam for years now, I can add additional stock on the top, sides, stuff like that. Now this is all still single stock. I saw Rafal asked about multi-body stock. The easiest way to do multi-body stock is using the stock model function. Right, Alex?
Yep, I was typing it out right now.
But yeah, the stock models will support as many stock bodies as you want. So if I want multiple stock models, that's the easiest way to do it as opposed to doing it in the stock setup page. So the next option here is any work holding. So I can say fixtures. I can assign them from a level. So I got both the levels there. Now I have both of these as my work holding. I can do that same isolate, and it'll show me, okay, I got everything else that's on the file selected as my work holding. That works similar to how it did. You would have to go in prior, you'd have to go into the like verify settings or simulator settings in order to get to that. And this is all stuff, like I was saying at the beginning, I don't have to do this. I can add this later if I want it. If I don't have any work holding in my part, I don't necessarily have to worry about it. And then the next thing here is the tooling tab. So this works very similar to how the tool tab was in the previous job setup. So I can click here and open my tool manager, and I can preload tools for my particular job, or I can just make sure, my feed calculation is the way I want it. Maybe I want a warrant of duplicate tool numbers, similar settings you guys are used to using in Mastercam there. And then the last one here, which I won't really cover today for the sake of time, but we also have the simulation tab. So say you got a 5-axis custom post and you have simulation turned in there, you can kind of double check that that's all set up correctly on that page as well. Or if you're even saying just doing vertical milling and you want to see the machine body and table, you can use one of the default machines if you want as well. So that was kind of it for all the general enhancements I had. And now we're going to touch on some of the actual Toolpath enhancements here to 2023. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm not covering all of the enhancements. I try to cover ones that I think are going to be most pertinent or useful to people on a day-to-day basis. But if you go to what'snew.mastercam.com, that'll give you a real deep rundown of everything that's new. Like I'm not covering like the mill tool icons were updated to give a little better visual feedback for 2023. That's just something you're kind of going to notice. And yeah, it's a little easier to see the toolpath types now, but and also if you want to see previous releases, say you're using Mastercam 2021 or 2020, you can go to previous releases here and we'll have the PDF version going back a handful, and it'll hit the highlights, and then you can do a deeper dive or even search Rollout webinar 2020 on our YouTube channel, and the recording will be up there for it. So that's the job setup there. Let me go to one of these toolpath files. One of the ones that I'm surprised it hasn't been added in Mastercam earlier, and I was always confused by this, but if you wanted to use slot mill in the past, it had to be two open-ended chains that were related to each other. So if I had a closed boundary, I was forced to use contour or pocket or some other toolpath. But really the short story here now is slot milling will support a closed boundary. And, depending on the shape of the geometry, a slot mill, the way it calculates the toolpath might be the best way to handle that particular geometry. So it's just nice now I can have, and I drew the wireframe here. I didn't necessarily need to, but I can use that closed loop chain to run a slot mill toolpath, and I don't have to worry about like opening up the geometry at the ends or anything like that. And it'll keep the toolpath nicely contained if it's an interior type slot like this example part I have here is. And one kind of tip I want to hit on in this file, when I first loaded 2023, I was always really used to, and it was a really handy tool, at the very top of the window here, I had the preview toolpath button that we added gosh, probably back in X9. So it's been years now since that's been added in there. And I was thinking, like, did they take away preview? I use that all the time as I'm trying to figure out, as I'm trying to fine tune a toolpath, I'll make one small change and hit preview, because like I always tell people when we're teaching Mastercam, if the toolpath isn't doing exactly what you want and then you change 20 different things and you get an error, well, which one of those 20 things caused the error? So you're much better off kind of making one change at a time and seeing what you get. But I always liked, having the preview. So if I go to, say, rough finish here and I change my plunge angle to, say, 3 degrees instead of 1 degree, it is just linked now that we added that generate toolpath in 2022, where it automatically generates when I hit the green check. If I hit the apply button here, that apply button is now the preview button. So as I hit apply here, it recalculates the toolpath and I get that 3-degree angle without having to hop out of the toolpath. So just know that, this preview toolpath button is gone because it's been now added to the apply button, which I think makes a little more sense instead of having kind of a unique button that isn't applicable across multiple Mastercam commands. And then one other thing here. So on my lead in, lead out here, before I could modify the feed rate if I was using perpendicular or tangent, we added profile ramp as a lead in option. As you can see here, this contour toolpath, that green line is technically my lead in to the finish, where, I'm kind of starting to cut the walls there. Well, now I can add it for 2023 here, as I can override the feed rate on the profile ramp command, where before I was just locked at whatever feed rate the toolpath was set to. And, this is some example toolpath, so the feed rate's super low, but say my feed rate's 20, I would be forced to use 20 in the past, where now I can override that feed rate to maybe something slower as I'm leading into the part, if I'm using that new profile ramp option. So that was all I had on some 2D toolpaths. Just hitting on a couple highlights there. So I'm going to bring in a 3D toolpath here and talk about the enhancements we've made to OptiRough. When I'm in these webinar or rollout type scenarios, I want to do it more from a theory-based perspective, and then you can apply it to whatever your parts are. So I try to keep the parts as simple as possible. Say this is op 2 of this part. I have all my work holding turned off. I machined the first side here to rough out the block, and now I want to rough out the second side. Now in the past, even though I had the stock model and I had no stock left here, the stock model would kind of look down infinitely in Z, and I would get a toolpath that looked like this, even though if you can see here, it's set to OptiRest, it's cutting all this extra air where no stock exists because the software wasn't smart enough to know that that stock wasn't there. But now in 2023, that same toolpath is calculating it correctly based on this stock that's remaining. So where you control that here is in the stock page. There's a little tick box here on detect undercut stock. If you're using the stock models, which I recommend if you're using OptiRough or any of the full 3D toolpaths, and if people aren't aware, if you're using Mastercam 2022 or newer, the base level of Mill also has OptiRough in there as an option, where it wasn't before. You only had surface rough pocket from like a 3D perspective. But now, so really all Mill customers now have access to OptiRough. I can say just turn on that detect undercut stock, and that's the only difference between these two toolpaths. Is you can see this one here, I have detect undercut stock turned off, and it's turned on in this one. So I'm not spending any time cutting air. Now the other thing I want to talk about in OptiRough here is just a small update, but since Mastercam has been holding to kind of a hard release date, so June 1st typically now is when the new version comes out every year. This didn't make it for 2022, it's now in 2023, but our updated and kind of refined linking parameters that was in all the other 3D toolpaths is also now in OptiRough. So I just have a little more control and a little cleaned up window if I really want to start fine tuning my transitions. Personally, I don't really use all those fancy sweep ins like per each pass. So I'll just set all these to 0 and hit save to my main defaults. And then I don't get those little loops going into every single cut. Now, depending on the material and stuff, that would be handy, and that's why they're available as options, but you can always turn them off globally and save them to the defaults here. And then anytime I would bring up OptiRough in the future, I wouldn't have to deal with modifying, maybe typically I only modify what my clearance plane is. Then I can kind of set the rest of these to what I typically use. And then I'm only fooling with the clearance plane every time I do a from scratch OptiRough toolpath, as opposed to using like an imported operation. Another one that a lot of you might be used to as a workaround, I used to show it as a tip in rollouts years ago. If I was doing like this toolpath here, you can see it's making an extra pass at the very bottom. Now before, I would have to, on my cut parameters page here, in order to ensure it would make a pass at the very bottom of whatever I selected, I would have to make my step down and step up equal. So a lot of times people do like 50-50 for both of them, and then that would kind of force a pass at the bottom. Well, now what I can do, and this one's doing it, I've had OptiRough do it kind of automatically for me, but per what the What's New document says, if I turn on maximum depth and I select whatever that maximum depth is, regardless of what my step down and step ups are, Mastercam will hard force a pass at whatever that maximum depth is I told it to. So you just go to the steep shallow page, turn on maximum depth, select whatever you want that depth to be. I can either type it in or select it there. If I type it in and it's something way deeper than my selected geometry, it's probably not going to do anything. What I recommend is, I can either say detect limit, or I can select off the model here on what I want to force that depth to be. So like this part, for instance, is 4 inches. And then another option in here, oops, I shouldn't have closed out to that. Before, if I had like minimum depth and where I wanted to start the toolpath, if my stock went way above the part, it might take too aggressive of a cut at the beginning. Now, if I just say Z depth and say include stock, the software will look at that stock model. And this is related to the same technology that was added for where it's detecting undercuts. It will take that stock model into account and add extra passes above the part as long as I select minimum depth and turn on include stock here. So another one related to that stock model technology is on the holder page here. If I say collision check and say I don't have a 5-axis machine, so I can't tilt to avoid a gouge, but I'm saying trim the holder to avoid a gouge, and I want, say, clearance on the bottom of the holder. Before, it would only collision check that clearance to my actual machining model workpiece, and it wouldn't necessarily look at the stock model. But now for 2023, the collision checking, if you turn it on here on the holder page, it will also look at the stock model. So, depending on the part, you might have a big, say you're working on a casting or a part that's, on its third op, and there's a little ear of stock hanging off where there isn't necessarily any of your machining or avoidance geometry. It'll still look at the stock model to avoid any collisions with the holder. And one other thing I want to talk about with OptiRough, I think this is the last OptiRough enhancement that I wanted to cover. On the toolpath control page, you might see this look a little different. So this automatic boundary is basically if anyone has done a OptiRough toolpath in 2022 and prior, and I didn't select any sort of containment, I would go to generate the toolpath, and that little error box would pop up and say, hey, the min max of the drive geometry is being used. We want to make you aware of that. Then you could say, okay, don't show me again this session. Like I'm just, roughing a part from the outside. I don't necessarily care about boundaries. Don't warn me about that again. Basically, that error box is gone in the way this workflow works now. You're using a stock model and it's, an OptiRest type toolpath. I don't really have to fool with the boundary at all because it's going to pull the boundary, and I can leave it set to none here, and it'll pull the boundary based off of what I defined in my stock page here. Now, if I want to get a little finer tuning control of that, I can still use, I can use a silhouette boundary where it'll kind of override whatever my stock is and use a silhouette. Like we added that as an option a couple years ago in Mastercam. But if I close out of here and say like top view, a silhouette boundary is basically taking a snapshot of what the software sees in 2D and assigning that as my boundary. And then the other options here is I can do like a bounding rectangle. So that'll kind of create a bounding box in the background. I can say include stock or not. And like always in Mastercam, I can always full control this and draw a boundary and select that as my boundary chain. And then I would get, the options. Do I want to compensate inside, outside, center? But if you're working with kind of like a prismatic type shape where I want to force it, I can use that rectangle or circle. But really kind of the short story here is if you're using a stock model, you don't necessarily have to worry about the boundary unless you want to fine tune control it. Just leave it to none. And then the automatic boundary will just kind of take care of itself. More of a 3D finishing toolpath. These last couple mill enhancements are going to be 3D finishing related. We had the waterline toolpath, which is a very common 3D finishing toolpath. If I wanted to cut, if you look at this toolpath here, I'm using the bottom to top option. Well, back in 2022 and prior, if I were to go in here under cut parameters, the cut order, it was a three-way radio button. I had by depth, I had optimize, and I had bottom to top. So if I wanted to do bottom to top, I wasn't able to select optimize because it was a radio button. I was forced to one of the three selections. So now where this geometry of this particular part lends itself well to going bottom to top, where it would always force to the by depth. So I get, all these extra retract, reposition moves. But now in 2023, I can say, yes, I want to optimize, which it's basically going to do the least amount of retract, reposition travel in order to achieve the next cut. I can say, just turn on bottom to top and leave it set to optimize. And then I get a much cleaner waterline toolpath where it's going to, do section by section, walk up that wall, do the top part, then cut across and do the other side. Whereas the previous one, very inefficient in that since it was going by depth, it was doing each depth cut, and I have 10x the amount of retract, reposition moves as opposed to using that optimize command. So just another handy little update to refine these toolpaths a little bit. So now the last one I want to, yes, Lee, that steep shallow trick will work for waterline. I also believe we added in 2023, yes, for waterline, you might not even have to use the steep shallow page, Lee. You can use what's called critical depths here. So it'll force a pass anytime it incorporates a flat, or I can say manual only, manual contact only. Alex, you might be able to fill in what the difference between like include and then include contact
Yeah,
is.
so it's basically if you had a flat and a wall next to it, do you want to cut just the flat area or the wall and the flat with it?
Okay.
That goes around the corner basically
Sure.
of the part. I don't have my screen to show, but if it's really easy, if you hit the little question mark in the bottom corner there, you can see a really good description of each one. And that's how I usually show it when you click on parameters there on the water line. Yeah, scroll all the way down. You can see right here. So one versus the other. One will cut the floor and the wall to the side of it. The other one will ignore it. You can see, you can choose the other. And then you see how it's just cutting the floor and just the wall. So they have a really good description of what would happen on there with that
Contact
one.
flats only is only that like drive surface where, include, it'll go all the way around. Got it.
Yeah. So I typically show that off right there, and I always just start off with include flats, and if it doesn't work for me, then I'll go to the next option and go from there as well.
Yeah, I'd say manual or that's all I had for waterline. That was a good question though, Lee. That was another, that's a fairly new feature that was added last year. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the equal scallop toolpath. What we added, and if you guys have noticed, depending on what 3D toolpath you have, we've added some enhancements over the past handful of years to limit or control the amount of engagement the tool is making to the part. Especially if you're running smaller finishing tools, you don't want it to get into a scenario where You know, maybe I'm only finishing a little bit of material on the wall, but then once it gets to the corner, even though I have a really small step over, that tool is engaged on 2 or 3 of the sides of the tool, as opposed to being like a traditional shoulder type cut, where depending on my speeds and feeds, I would overload the tool and break it, or, you know, get a worse finish, so forth. So I just have a generic OptiRough toolpath here to get most of the material out, and I have a stock model to kind of show where I still have a decent amount of material in the corners here. Now, if I did a regular equal scallop toolpath, it's just going to finish it like equal scallop does. You know, it's I really like, since they've added this toolpath, it always has nice clean toolpath motion at the very top of the geometry. It's very consistent on the step over, kind of regardless of the shape of the tool, where the old scallop was kind of it still has its use, and that's why we haven't taken it out of the software. We don't really try to take out any tool paths into future versions. But if I wanted to control this further and use equal scallop, it was kind of tough to get equal scallop to do like a semi-finish type operation. So what we've added in 2023 here on the parameters tab under the stock page, because toolpaths, say like Waterline now has a maximum engagement option, where I can say, you know, based off this stock model, I want the waterline to engage only a certain amount based on a distance into the material. So I won't over engage. But what we added to equal scallop here is this step in and maximum step in for both distance, and then I can control the number of times it's going to do it. A couple kind of tips about this is, A, don't think of this as once I turn this on, this step in and the maximum step in, it's really no longer a finishing toolpath. Think of it as an intermediate, like semi-finish, rest rough type operation. Second tidbit of this, and this is feedback I've already given Mastercam, is I really like the idea, but whoever wrote this toolpath and the way the algorithm and, you know, all the hundreds of lines of math that all these, or probably tens of thousands of lines of math that make up how these toolpaths actually function, I think the guy that wrote it was assuming people would only be using bullnose or flat end mills. Because you can see here, my tool I'm using is just a 1/4 inch ball end mill, but my parameters here on the stock page are kind of way off of what I'm defining my rough tool as. So as I've been playing around with this and seeing how this works, I can still get the correct function if I'm using a ball nose. Just be mindful that if I am using a ball nose to do this sort of rest roughing operation, like in my example here, that you're going to have to play a little bit with what the diameter of my actual roughing tool and corner radius is. What I've found is kind of a rule of thumb here is if I want my corner radius to be typically 4x of what my actual tool I'm using is. So I'm using a 1/4 inch ball end mill here. I set my corner radius as 1 inch and doubled the diameter to kind of get the output I want. Because what that's going to do now is, with that turned on, if I was using, you know, a flat or a bull nose, I would keep those exactly to saying, you know, okay, I used a 1 inch bull end mill with a 125 corner radius, and I would just plug that into here if my tool here was also either a bull nose or a flat. But since I'm using a ball nose, I have to fool with those parameters a bit. What I essentially get here then is a nice toolpath that's going to clean up, and like I was talking about before, think of it as kind of like the pencil toolpath, but where I want to remove a lot more material than a pencil is typically designed to do. And then what I can do is I can further control this. You know, say I want to do some depth cuts. I'm using a small 1/4 inch end mill. Say this is a harder material. I can go into here in the parameters and I can force more passes. So it will generate the number of passes kind of based on my distance if I leave this maximum step-ins turned off. But I can further control it by turning it on, and say I want to make 5 there. And now instead of just doing a single pass, going to do multiple passes and kind of work its way in to those given corners using it. And it might not be a full 5. I think this one is actually only 3, but based on my step over, I'm just kind of giving it more room to move. Where my first example in operation 4 here, I was forcing just an absolute single pass of the way this toolpath works now with that option turned on. But here I can give it more room to create additional passes based on my step over. So even though there's like that little bit of a workaround there on how to get it to work with a ball nose, I still think there's a lot of use cases here, especially anyone with doing some like intricate 3D machining, that I can apply this to parts. We'll see you on the next one, and appreciate everyone's time, and have a good day. And thanks, Alex.
Yep. Thanks for coming out, everyone.